So in February, you published a new book titled Etude, The Poetry of Dreams Plus Other Fragments. And it's a beautiful book. And I wanted to talk about that. But first, it just occurred to me now as I was considering the title, the word etude, which is usually, used to refer to short musical pieces.
Yes.
Can you, how would you describe
yes. So this goes back to painting. So interestingly enough, so growing up in the Midwest in the 60s, you didn't have access to a lot of culture directly. And so probably in the middle of junior high school, I subscribed to the Time Life series of art. And I think this was a set of books. I think I still have them. I think there were about 30 or 40 books, and they were these long, thin volumes with lots of pictures. And they usually described an art era or an artist. And one of them was James Abbott McNeill Whistler. And there was a lyricism to his paintings and also to the titles of the paintings. And he oftentimes used musical references. And I was fascinated by this idea of musical references, the idea that it sort of transported you into looking at things in a different way. So he would have, abstraction number 6 in gray and silver, or almost like using the word prelude to talk about a painting. And the idea of etudes, which is studies in French, relative to music, I thought was appropriate to the idea that all of these paintings, in a sense, were studies. They were all sort of preparing for something in a romantic notion, something in the future that hadn't formed itself yet. And also, I suppose it was a little self-depreciating, that it meant that I'm still working on it. I'm still wandering.
Yeah.
Versus a building, which is not a study. It's actually quite concrete. So this permits me a little bit of indulgence, that I don't have to take myself too seriously.
Right. And, like I said, the book looks beautiful. And by that, I also mean that the book itself is designed beautifully. And I was wondering whether that was...
The thing that's really precious about it, which is hard to overestimate the impact of, is the whole book is printed on watercolor paper.
Oh.
And it's interesting because it took 3 full months to do the color proofing, because offset printing companies are not set up to print on highly absorbent paper. So we had to do 3 full wet proofs on the actual printer they were going to print it on in China. Normally you do color proofing on a proofing press, and then the press itself is so close to the proofing press that you're in good shape. But in this case, we had to wait for the press to be available to do our little tiny print run of proofing copies. And we also used a very special red ink called rhodamine in order to get the blacks in the improvisation section to be as crisp and dark as they were, because the paper just sucks everything up into it. And it was quite a process to get it to work.
Yeah, because I was going to bring up the design, but it's the materials too. I mean,
in addition, yeah. Oh, yeah. And then the design. So the design is a very deep collaboration with this incredible graphic artist named Jeremy Mendy, who works out of San Francisco. He's a professor at the California College of Arts. And we've been working for many, many years. I don't know if you had a chance to look at some of the visual poems that were part of, I think we sent way too many things, but so he and I collaborated on the visual poems. And so what it would be is that with the visual poems is we sit down and I talk about this philosophical thing that I wanted to express in visual form. And then he would kind of think about it and he'd come back with options. And then we would start. And sometimes these things would take 10, 20 hours each in order for us to kind of balance what it needed to be and what's the right image and what's the right tonality. And he had a really beautiful, sketchy kind of quality that we kept throughout all of them. But it was an adventure in collaboration to figure out like how to get these to express a very intellectual notion in a visual form. And our little joke was the first visual poem set that went public was used in the Venice Biennale in a collateral event that I was part of in 2016. And you go to the art museums in Venice, and this is before, this is oftentimes in a Gothic time when paintings told stories because people couldn't read and write. And so we were joking around that people now are so glued to their phones that they don't read anymore as well. So they need visual cues to tell them the story about what life means and what culture means and what philosophy means. So we've kind of come full circle. So we were joking around about how that was the relevance of the visual poems, is this allows people to read a narrative without the burden of words.
Yeah. And, I was fascinated with it because, again, maybe some of the listeners, who hear the word poetry will be more inclined to think of the traditional sort of poet format, the structure. It's just words on paper. But we're talking about something different. In fact, when I was looking at it, it was, from a Western standpoint, obviously, it was kind of making me think of all the artists, like, for example, the futurists at the start of the 20th century who worked a lot with playing with words in an artistic way. Yeah. And then I'm pretty sure the German expressionists did the same thing. It was something that was that they experimented with a lot at the turn of the 20th century or in the earlier years.
Yeah, so Jeremy and I are both fascinated by those eras in graphic design. And I actually used to teach a graphic design / digital architecture course at UC Berkeley for 5 years. But I really wanted to work with Jeremy on the book. And so we started a process. Originally, we were only going to do 8 of the poems. Of the 42 poems, we were only going to do 8 of them in a kind of a graphic format. But we got so inspired, we did all 42. And it was interesting because sometimes Jeremy would want the format of the poem to relate to the watercolor. And so each of those poems, I'd say, together, we spent 3 to 4 hours on each one, and it would start with me reading the poem to him. And also the poem has a certain inherent format to it that he needed to respect, like how it broke down into subsections. But then where it went from there, it was kind of open-ended. So sometimes, though, he would create a graphic scenario where it was too disruptive to read. And I said, Jeremy, the thing about poetry is imagine you're skipping down a road and you're humming a song and you're really getting into the cadence of what you're doing. And suddenly there's a sign in the road and you have to stop skipping and stop singing and read the sign to know where to go next. If that happens, you've ruined the poem. So there was an incredible amount of back and forth and massaging and what's the right narrative, what's the right thing to pick off of. And so sometimes the graphic design relates to the poem itself, and sometimes it relates to the watercolor, and sometimes it relates in an unusual way. But I think it came out quite delightfully.
We haven't talked about dreams yet. And yeah.
Well, one of the things about the watercolors, and to some degree the poetry, is none of the watercolors exist, none of the things depicted actually exist in physical space. So they're all memories of something rather than the thing directly itself. So as an architect, we design a new reality. So all of the watercolors have been designed. So even if they're somewhat referential to a physical space, it's not going out there and sketching. It's sketching the memory of that place. And so if you go to that place, you go, oh, well, he got this wrong and he got that wrong. But I'm trying to grasp the spirit of what I remember and what was emotionally meaningful to me about it. And so I know that's not unique, but that's an underlying aspect of all of the watercolors.